Alright guys, welcome back to chapter 35. We are about to wrap up World War II, and that means defeating Japan. We already finished defeating Germany, now let's finish the war. And as we get into late 1944, the situation for Japan is pretty dire. The American Air Force is bombing Japan relentlessly, using incendiary bombs in particular, which were very devastating against Japanese cities, which were mainly wooden buildings. American submarines are doing to Japan what Germany had wanted to do against Britain, that is to just surround the island and cut them off and sinking their ships, causing the country itself to basically begin to collapse. Speaking of American submarines, they also could be used for other purposes than just sinking ships. They could be used for reconnaissance, to land people kind of, in the middle of the night, kind of behind enemy lines type situation. They could also be used to recover downed airmen, like this guy right here who had been shot down over a Japanese-held island. There's the pilot. That's him being rescued. That is future President George H.W. Bush. Tokyo, Kobe, Osaka, Nagoya, all these Japanese cities you can see heavily damaged, burned out. The red area means burned out by American incendiary bombs, and you can see the devastating impact it's going to have on Japanese cities. Now, as we close in on the Japanese home islands, we're facing a dilemma, and the dilemma is, how do we end this war with as few American lives lost as possible? And the final two big battles are, I think, very telling as far as how the Japanese resistance is going to react to American war plans. In March of 1945, this is just before the German surrender over in Europe, American Marines are going to land on Iwo Jima, which you can see is right here, tiny little rock of an island, not much going on there, but the airstrips we have to get our hands on. This would allow American planes who are flying from here to there to bomb Japan, a place for them to land if they have engine trouble or they're being shot down or something along those lines. This will also deny Japan a place to put their fighter planes that could be used to harass American bombers. In 35 days for this island, Americans are going to be killed. Almost 7,000 Americans are going to die on this island. Japanese losses, about 20,000 soldiers killed in this battle. This is the famous flag raising on Mount Suribachi, which, if we go back to the map, Mount Suribachi right down here. This was taking place during the battle, and several of these flag raising men here would die in the battle for Iwo Jima. And this flag raising became, this iconic image of the war. And if you go to Washington, D.C. today, you can see it recreated in the Marine Corps Memorial. Our final battle in the Pacific, now in retrospect, last battle, we didn't know it was going to be the last battle at the time, is the battle for Okinawa. Now, Okinawa is considered, Japanese island in the sense that Japanese civilians live there, unlike places like Iwo Jima or some of these outlying islands here. This is really Japanese territory, and it's a very bloody battle. We land on April 1st, April Fool's Day, 1945. The battle rages until June of 1945. Over 12,000 Americans are going to die. We think somewhere in the ballpark of 200,000 Japanese soldiers and civilians are going to die in Okinawa. And if you combine Iwo Jima and Okinawa together, what you have is a big warning that if you were to invade the home islands of Japan, that losses would be almost incomprehensibly big. Several images for the fight for Okinawa. You can see a Japanese soldier here, Japanese civilians caught in the crossfire. Again, a preview of what would be if we had we invaded the Japanese home islands. All right, the Kamikaze. You've heard of the Kamikazes before. These are Japanese suicide pilots. Kamikaze means divine wind, a godly wind, in other words. And the thought was that these suicide pilots, by crashing their airplanes into American ships, they would somehow destroy the American fleet and prevent the invasion of Japan. And these Kamikaze are willingly sacrificing themselves for their country, for their emperor. And you can see just some images here of the Kamikaze. This picture in particular is dramatic, and then you have the Kamikaze right here, an American ship right here, just just milliseconds before impact. Now, it turns out the Kamikaze, while they did sink several dozen ships and kill several thousand Americans, were not all that effective. About 4/5 of all Kamikaze failed to hit their target, many of them crashing into the sea or being shot down before. This is not just American skill at shooting down Japanese planes. It's also reflective of the fact that Japanese pilots are poorly trained. Many of them simply just missed their target altogether. All right, this brings us to the Manhattan Project and the final stages of World War II. And the purpose of the atomic bombings on Japan is pretty simple. The loss of life on the American side would have been estimated, several 100,000 Americans probably would have been killed and wounded, and Japanese life and wounded, losses would have been just extraordinary. And to prevent all that, the atomic bomb is going to be used to convince the Japanese to surrender. Now, at the final meeting of the Big Three, at the Potsdam Conference, the Big Three issues an ultimatum to Japan that either surrender unconditionally or be destroyed. Now, the destroyed part was rather vague. What does that mean? Well, what it's a reference to is a top secret project called the Manhattan Project, and this has its origins before we ever got in the war. Back in 1940, Einstein, you can see him here, had sent a letter. You can just make out a signature here. Had sent a letter to the president, basically outlining the possibility of fission as a weapon. In other words, the breaking down of atoms, splitting of atoms, releasing energy could be weaponized, and Congress is going to step up and spend about $2 billion on this project. And what pushes us to work harder than ever is the fear that the Germans were working on a project of their own. And Hitler with an atomic bomb is a very scary thought. And so you can see the different pieces of the puzzle here that will come together out here in New Mexico with the very first test. Of note, I thought I'd mention Oak Ridge, which was not even a town before this project. It was built to house the workers and scientists. So it's the modern Oak Ridge, Tennessee, literally owes its existence to the Manhattan Project. By July of 1945, we are ready to test this device out in the desert. The scientists have nicknamed it Gadget. This is also known as the Trinity test, and there it is detonating. You see this little marker here, 100 meters. That's about the width of a American football field. So imagine that being a football field and multiplying that over. That's a big, big, big explosion for just one bomb. Here we are at ground zero. This is Leslie Groves, the military head of this project, and this is Robert Oppenheimer, an American physicist who was in charge of the scientists developing this weapon. Well, we didn't get a chance to use this bomb on Germany because they had surrendered back in May. The bomb's not ready until August to be used in combat. And on August 6, 1945, the B-29 named Enola Gay was flown over Hiroshima, a city in southern Japan. 70,000 civilians mainly are going to be killed instantly, and about double that number will die ultimately from burns and radiation. There's just a look at the bomb itself. Little Boy, they called it. The uranium weapon. And several images of the after effect. Again, we have entered a whole new world after Hiroshima. There's a before of Hiroshima and an after. And just it's almost like someone just took an eraser and started erasing the city. That's how devastating this bomb is. 3 days later, we drop another atomic bomb on another Japanese city, Nagasaki. This is a different type of bomb. It's a plutonium implosion bomb. It's a little more powerful than the Hiroshima bomb. The death toll is slightly less, though. Partly because of Nagasaki's geography. The bomb landed in kind of a valley, and that prevented some of the explosive force from spreading wider than it would have normally. So fewer casualties, even though it was a bigger bomb. Nonetheless, still devastating. Again, before and after. Now, we come back to the idea of unconditional surrender, something that the big three, or at least two of the big three, had adopted at the Casablanca Conference. And it was decided that there would be one exception to this. We agreed to allow the Japanese to surrender on one condition, that condition being that their emperor, Hirohito, would remain the emperor of Japan. He would not be imprisoned or executed or put on trial or anything like that. And that was one condition we could live with. And on August 14th, the Allies agreed to a ceasefire. And then on September 2nd, 1945, the Japanese formally surrender on the battleship USS Missouri in Tokyo. And this is also known as Victory in Japan Day, or VJ Day. VE Day was Victory in Europe Day. So we have two V days. And I got to say, I mean, I really think he blends in pretty well. Just saying. I think he does. There is Douglas MacArthur signing for the Americans on the USS Missouri. And Americans now incredibly happy. Victory in Japan Day. It is truly the end of the war. Unlike VE Day, which was, only half the war, now the war is totally done. And there were lots and lots of young men who were incredibly happy because they knew they didn't have to invade Japan and risk their lives. The war is over. Happiness, people are just absolutely ecstatic. And it's the famous picture, sometimes referred to as simply just the kiss. This is in Times Square in New York City, and the sailor and the nurse, well, they didn't know each other. This was all spontaneous, and I think it sort of exemplifies the outpouring of emotion, just the happiness of knowing that the war, the most destructive war in all of human history, is finally over. Quick note on the Allies being triumphant here. World War II is the second most deadly war of all the wars America's ever fought, second only to the Civil War. About 1 million Americans are either going to be killed or wounded. However, in the grand scheme of things, if you look at American losses compared to other allies, especially the Soviet Union, our losses are relatively small in comparison. The Soviet Union bled and died in numbers that are almost incomprehensible. Estimates range well over 20 million Soviet soldiers and civilians died in this war. And unlike a lot of our allied compatriots like the French, the British, and especially the Soviets, our country was relatively unscathed. The exception of something like, say, Pearl Harbor, we really didn't suffer a lot of civilian casualties or destruction. So the war was definitely over there as opposed to in our own backyard. And that is just a quick review of World War II. So a couple key things you need to look at when you're thinking about World War II for the AP test. Know how it affected different groups: women, Native Americans, African Americans, Japanese Americans. I would definitely focus in on them and how they were treated. I would focus on some social changes like the migrations that took place. The Great Migration comes to mind. And as far as individual battles, that is not something that the AP test tends to focus heavily on, so I wouldn't go crazy on that. But I would certainly maybe look at the debate over the atomic bomb, whether or not that was the right or wrong thing to do. It's a big historically debated topic. And that should be about it for World War II, guys. That is it for Chapter 35 as well.